excited that the State Elections Director, Brian Caskey, has been able to join us here today. When we think about the funding of elections, you know, there are obviously, we've heard all about all the different players in conducting the election, but it's not just about voting equipment. It's about voter registration, it's about voter education, voter outreach, and some of those things are in statute in some states, and some things are not. Some of them are cultural, and whether or not a place sends out a sample ballot, or whether or not there's a voter guide or a publicity pamphlet. So there are all of these complexities, as we've seen this morning, around what are the costs, where does the money come from. So this afternoon, we're going to pivot a little bit, and we're first going to talk about what's it like here in Kansas from the state's perspective. What sort of activities do they have? Where does their funding come from? You know, what exactly the model is here in Kansas from the state. And then we're going to hear from local election officials on their perspective of the Kansas model. And then we're going to bring it all home with some conversations around where do we go from here. So with that, thank you, Brian. And if you want to go ahead and start your opening remarks, that would be lovely.
I would love to. My name is Brian Caskey. I'm the Director of Elections for the state of Kansas. As of last week, I've been a director for over 9 years. Thankfully, I still have my hair, unlike my boss, who was here last night. I've been in the election industry since January of 1998, so I have seen an election or two, and I would like to say that I'm very excited to be here. I love talking about elections. It's what I do all day, every day, literally. So it's nice to talk to people who know stuff and are not antagonistic about what I have to say. So this is exciting. So I'm very thankful to the Dole Institute for having us here. I know most of the faces in the crowd, and for those of you I don't, please say hi afterwards. But I'm here to give a little bit about the state perspective. But it will be quick, because Kansas, like many states, we are a bottom-up state, and the state does not fund elections, except for one noticeable 2024 only exception. So my colleagues from the counties that speak after me will correct me on everything I say wrong. But in Kansas, counties pay for the election. They run the election, they pay for it, and basically the state just provides guidance. There is no state funding of elections, with one exception, which is the presidential preference primary that Kansas is having this year. It is the first primary we've had since 1992. Unfortunately, I was here then, but that is the last time that the state has provided any funding. The state is reimbursing the counties for the funding this year. That is the only state funds that go to elections. What the state does provide is they normally provide the matching funds for HAVA dollars. And when Don Palmer said he was thinking about a 50-50 split, I almost vomited. We'll talk later on. But generally speaking, that is the only thing that the state provides from a monetary perspective. We are one of the states that has HAVA money in the bank. We still have money in the bank from the original 2004 appropriation. We still have a little bit of money left from that, and that's on purpose. As you all know, HAVA requirements are permanent, funding is not. And so from the very beginning, I've been involved in making sure that we always have some money in the bank to address things that we cannot oversee. And no offense to the federal government is not generally trustworthy when it comes to funding what they said that they would. And HAVA is a prime example of that. Even though we received federal funds at the beginning of HAVA, my recollection is that it was 1/3 shortchange based on what was originally authorized but never appropriated. HAVA was never fully appropriated from the beginning, and we never trusted that they would do so after that. So we still have money in the bank. Not very much, but we do. And the reason for that is that we are responsible for the statewide voter registration system. We have to pay for that. We have to administer that. Now, we work with our counties, and the counties pay a large portion of that. But that system has an end of life, and we are coming up on, gosh, version 3, version 4 of that system. And as you all know, that takes millions of dollars to procure. We are not likely to get a state general fund appropriation to do that. So that's one reason why we still have money in the bank, is we have to get that money from somewhere. And I sure hope that we don't have to beg the counties to do that. So we have less security money in the bank, mostly because we've done a better job in the last 2 to 3 years of providing grants to the counties. We've used a lot of that. Almost all of that money has been spent either on behalf of the counties through our office or grants to the counties. So we have done a better job of that, I would say, in the last 2 to 3 years. And that's primarily where our grants go, are to the counties. This year, we're doing a physical security grant program. It was not mandatory, but 84 of our 105 counties did participate in that, which we thought was a pretty good turnout. So, but essentially, that's where we are from a state perspective.
Great. Well, I had a couple of questions I wanted to follow up on. So you mentioned the statewide voter registration database. And you mentioned that the state also does the 5% match, which I also almost threw up when Don said 50%. I thought that's going to go over like a lead balloon. No one on either side of the aisle is going to like that.
That's right.
So it's going to make that 5%. It's going to make that 5% sound really good.
It is. I want to make sure he heard that complaint first.
Yes. So, well, I'm glad that it came from you and not from me. So I get all of that. Some of the questions I do have, though, is so you are the state elections director. There is the secretary's office, and I think that last night Secretary Schwab mentioned how your office is funded. And so when we think about the funding of elections, I wanted to expand how we're thinking about what the functionalities are that are required to conduct the election. So when we think about secretaries of state's offices, state boards of elections, and some of these other places, what are the where are those funds coming through and for the statewide voter registration system, for some of the security programs? And I think I heard, if I heard correctly, some of that is coming from HAVA dollars and other things, and appropriations of that 5% match. But what are some of the other streams, or how is your office funded?
So I believe that we have a very unique funding mechanism relative to most other states. We are not state general fund appropriated, like a lot of Secretary of States are. We are a fee-funded agency only, dating back to Ron Thornburg days. I probably don't have the year exactly correct, but in the early 2000s, the Secretary of State's office went to a fee fund model where we charge fees on all the filings that come into our office. Thankfully, we have a thriving business services division. We get hundreds of thousands of business filings every year, and we have a fee on that. The elections division, the only fees that we charge are a very minuscule fee of people when they file for office and for people who purchase data from us. So we raise a few $1,000s a year, but the vast majority of our funding comes from business customers. So we are a self-funded agency with no general fund dollars to speak of. And so the corporate customers of Kansas are funding the operations of the state election office, which I believe is very unique across the country.
That's a really interesting point to raise, and I think that it'll be interesting to look at other offices that do have business filings, because I believe most Secretary of States have some sort of filing. So the question will be, maybe they're not charging enough, or maybe they're not charging anyone for some of these things, so some of these services. So having, when we talk about funding and identifying sources of funding that are already being done, because that's one of the things we've already heard is in elections, we often like to talk about things that have been tried in different places and learning from those trials, learning what worked, what didn't work, learning whether or not it might work back home. And so I think that's kind of what this effort is thinking about, is let's try and identify where it's already been tried. We're not coming up with anything new and revolutionary here. It's just more coming up with how is this currently working in some areas, and are there other places that we can maybe gather information from? So I think that's really interesting to know, because I haven't heard of that being the sole funding mechanism for other states.
Right.
It's not to say there might be some out there, but
I'm not aware of any that has that exact funding model. Most states get most of their appropriation through the state budget process. We are an exception to that. There might be one or two other states, but I think we're pretty unique when it comes to that.
and is it, sorry to just like keep diving down into the weeds here, but you know me, so you know that's exactly where I'm gonna
all good.
wallow for just briefly. And you mentioned business services. Is that tied at all? Do you do motor vehicles? Do you tie to any of that kind of filing revenue, or?
So in Kansas, no. The
Okay.
Division of Motor Vehicles is underneath the governor's office, not the Secretary of State. So that's not a funding mechanism that we can have. We have a very strong relationship with our DMV. We do lots of voter registration activity back and forth, but that they do not. I wish they worked for me, quite frankly, most days, but they do not. So we primarily do business filings across the board, corporations, LLCs, and then UCC, Uniform Commercial Code filings. Those are our primary sources of filings.
It's fascinating, because there are secretaries that oversee Department of Motor Vehicles. And I think I mentioned this morning when I was in Maricopa County, the county recorder in Arizona, you have a technology fund, and a portion, I think it's $1 per filing, or a percentage of 10% or whatever it is, has to go into a technology fund. So I think that there are some models of where fee-based filing can be informative and can help to fund certain activities. When it comes to candidate filing, do you charge much for that? You said it was a couple $1,000s, so
It's $20 per candidate per filing. So
maybe not charging enough, just saying, maybe,
well,
maybe.
I probably wouldn't disagree with that, but quite frankly, for legislators, they're only paying $70. So I'm not sure politically that I can go much more than 20. So.
Okay.
But yeah, I mean, yes, we always look at that. But quite frankly, we only get 300 candidates every 2 years. There's not much more you can squeeze out of
It's not
that.
going to be your sugar daddy.
It is not.
No. Okay, understood. And the data, sounds like that's also an area where some places don't charge for data, they
Right.
just put it up. Some places it costs more to process getting the data out for people than it is for the funds that they're getting, so right-sizing those kind of services is certainly interesting.
Yep.
You mentioned also security, and the cost of security and having security funds and grants that have been made. We heard a little bit about that last night. I'd love to hear more from you, because as you mentioned, you started in '98. I started in the primary in '98 as a temporary worker, and that was my downfall. I was hired at the phone company, but they were on strike, and so I was like, well, I can't just sit around while they're on strike. I'll go work a temporary job, and I was marking test decks for logic and accuracy tests in 1998, and I was hooked. So a lot has changed in that time. And so when we think about security and the funding that we're receiving now, because now there is attention about it, and we heard earlier, today, around how do we shore up our systems against foreign nation states. And a lot of that kind of work is falling on the shoulders of the state. And so when we talk about that funding, has it been contemplated that the state will appropriate funds to help in that matter? Or are they just saying, try and get money from Washington?
That's a great question, and I would say from my chair, since the designation of elections as critical infrastructure, I think state legislative leaders look to this now as more of a federal function and not yours, because we are critical infrastructure, and it's the federal government's job to make sure that we are secure. So that's my sense. I have not heard a legislative leader tell me that directly, but that's certainly my sense, is that since that designation, it is the federal government's job to make sure that we secure our elections. Now, states run elections, and they are very adamant that states run elections, but in this, especially with security, with the critical infrastructure designation, that I do believe that they expect the federal government to fund a lot of that activity.
So in some cases, I was thinking about this with our conversation with the EAC commissioners. A lot of the conversation around funding and needs come full circle when we talk about how we frame these conversations, how we frame what the need is, how we tell the story of elections. And so when it comes to kind of the underfunding of some of the functions, framing it in a security context in this moment makes an abundance of sense because that's more palatable for people. But we have a very fine line we have to walk, right? Because if you talk too much about the vulnerabilities in a security sense, then we cross over into we're going to undermine trust, we're going to potentially undermine confidence, we're going to give those who want to question the legitimacy of the election fodder. So this is something I think all election officials are grappling with. If you have the answer, will you please share?
I do not. If I had the answer, I would have a different job. It's a great question, and I know that today I still struggle with where we are on that. I am a big proponent of trying to be as factual as possible while providing as much coverage to local election officials and to the state as possible when it comes to security. I never talk about specific programs, specific initiatives, other than, generally speaking, what I'm required to say, in part because I don't want to give any of our adversaries an inch. I do not want to give an inch. Is that the right approach? Honestly, I don't know. Like, at the same time, I work for the government, and we are designed to be transparent in all things. And so balancing transparency with security, there's a lot of tension there. But my job is to make sure that we have an election that everyone can count on, is accurate, is secure, and the people can trust. And so I'm always going to err on behalf of the structure and the process.
You are 100% right. So, up until the last few years, it was balancing security and access with transparency overall. And we have just added in a third balance to the scale, and trying to keep those all level and equal is really a challenge, yes. I think.
It is. And I'm sensitive to that. Like, I want people to be able to ask questions, and we want to be transparent, and we want to assure the public, especially the voting public, that we are doing everything we can to secure the election. There are lots of things that we do. The county election officers don't even know all of them. They know most of them, like, we've given grants to them. There's a couple programs that we do on their behalf, but not even they know everything that we're doing because, as you know, security, every time that we talk about it, we're already behind because something's already changing. And so I'm sensitive to it. I do not yet have all of the right answers.
Darn it. Okay. Well,
Someday.
there are dozens and dozens of questions that I want to talk about, but I'm trying to keep us focused on funding, which for me, I'm always like off on tangents. So I want to pull it back around to the funding model. And when you talk about the pass-throughs to the counties and the pass-throughs and what the money's being spent on and transparency, I think how we receive funds, what those monies are spent on, that is a place where we can be really transparent. And I feel like that is an area where shedding some light on what people are spending the money on and where it came from and how much of it is county driven, from Charles's slide showing that everybody kind of believes it's coming from the state and from the federal government. I think that's an area where we can have efforts like this that will really be helpful in having the American voter understand how their elections are being paid for and what their tax dollars are going towards. And so I get in this conflict with myself when we talk about the potholes, because that is a visceral thing. If you're someone who drives on the road and you hit a pothole, it makes you angry. If that pothole is on your way to work every morning, it makes you angry every day, probably twice a day, if it's big enough that it goes across both lanes. And so when it comes to elections, what are our election potholes? It's having a long line, it's not being able to get, call in and get your question answered, it's finding out that your ballot was rejected or that your registration isn't correct. There are certain things that we can do to improve the service to the voter. And I feel like those are some of the things that we need to be thinking about when we frame up this conversation about funding, is bring it home to roost, just like that pothole conversation, to explain, it's really helpful. So I was in the western part of the country, Arizona. We got sample ballots. We got publicity pamphlets that explained all the propositions. We got candidate brochures. We got all this information. So I felt really informed as a voter on judicial retention. We had this judicial productivity review. I mean, it was awesome. I live in the East now. I get nothing. It kills me because I like to believe I'm an educated voter. I go out, I seek out trying to find information about candidates, and it's really difficult. So I think some of the way that we can think about funding is bringing some of those tangibles to the voters themselves. So having a piece of equipment that's calibrated properly, it's never going to be as intuitive as your phone. And I hesitate to hold mine up because mine is super old. So it's more like voting equipment, but even it is advanced compared to voting systems.
Well, so Kansas is kind of all over the place on that. I want to talk about voting machines since you brought it up, and going back, 15 years ago, 20 years ago now, to HAVA. So originally, right after HAVA, the first round of voting equipment, the state purchased that with HAVA funds. We had a formula. Every single county got money. There was a state match required of every county, but we exhausted 2/3 of all of our HAVA dollars on voting machine contracts right off the bat. And the state had those contracts. So we negotiated one price per county, maintenance, all of that, but that was only for round one. Round two, we knew that we didn't have enough money, so we let our contracts lapse. And so then the counties moved into the Wild West, where every county was left to fend for themselves, both contractual-wise and dollar-wise. And so today, in Kansas, counties are the only entity responsible for everything voting machine related. All we do is certify, and quite frankly, we rely on the EAC for the certification process. So where we used to be heavily involved 15 years ago, we are not involved at all now. And I'm not sure most people understand that. And if you're a county, I can understand why there would be some colorful words to say for someone in my position.
That's the next panel.
I know, they'll yell at me about that.
You're going to stay for that, right, Brian?
I may leave for that one. No, and so I acknowledge that. When it comes to long lines and where you go vote, that's strictly a county decision. The state has zero involvement. We have counties that only have one polling place. We have counties that have polling places, not on every corner, but more than some people would advise. But that's a county decision, and we want it to be a county decision because they're closest to the voter. But it is not consistent statewide. There's no standard on the number of voters per polling place, and so again, the state we wash our hands out of that. But when it comes to resources for the voters, like where do I go vote? Where's my polling place? Do we have a sample ballot? The state does provide a resource through our voter registration system that everyone can go to. We have one website that everyone can go, regardless of county, to get your polling place, your sample ballot, track your advanced ballot by mail. So we offer that, but it's not a requirement. We offer that to every county. Most counties do that. But it's not a mandate. We don't have a law that does that. And so should we mandate that at some point? That's an open discussion I'm happy to talk to everyone about. But that's kind of where we are. And to emphasize the fact that counties really do run elections. We are not sending out any mailers. The state of Kansas does not do what Florida or California and other states do. There's no voter guide. There's no pamphlet coming from the state. You are left to your own devices. All that we have is the list of every candidate and how to contact them. Some candidates are better than others at being reachable, But I'm sympathetic to the voting public because there's not a resource. There's not a resource, and that is the policy of the state of Kansas. Like that's not going to change, and so we provide every piece of contact information that we get, but I'm sympathetic to that.
Yeah, and it's one of those situations where if I didn't know any better or didn't know any differently, not to make a judgment call on, if I didn't know any differently, that would just be what I was accustomed to. But once you, and I'm sure election officials, you've all gotten the call from somebody that moved from another state, another jurisdiction, and they said, where's this? Or how do I get that? Because that's how I did it where I came from. That can be challenging to bridge. So we have a few minutes, and I have a question that was asked last night of the secretary that I would love to ask you as well, and that is if you could wave your magic wand around election funding, or the model of election funding, or the amount of funding, or whatever, however you want to interpret the question. With this, it's a magic wand after all. It can do whatever you want. What would that do and be, and why?
Thank you for putting me on the spot on that.
I gave him a heads up of like 2.5 minutes before we started.
Which didn't allow me to ask
No.
my boss what he said.
Oh.
So, and as a reminder, I serve at the pleasure of the Secretary of State, so hopefully I'm still employed after this. But honestly, what I would ask is, well, two things. One, I don't think there's a magic bullet. I don't think there's one answer. I strongly believe that states run elections. And within us, it's the counties that run elections. And I believe that model is good because the counties are the closest to the voters. Like, what works in Wallace County and their 700 registered voters will not work in Johnson County and their 500,000 registered voters. So I believe firmly that the county election officers are closest to the people. What I would wish is that everyone within those counties that's responsible for appropriating money would listen to the experts. I'm not taking shots at any elected official, but I do believe that during the budget process, we have very knowledgeable, very hardworking county election officers, and that's who county commissioners and county administrators and county budget directors should be listening to. They know the most. And elections are complicated. They are very complicated, especially now. And although we do a great job of making it easy, it's like a duck. I'm calm up here, but my feet are going nuts. That's my wish, is that the people that are responsible need to talk to the people that know what's going on and listen to them, because everyone has needs. Everyone has, I think in a lot of counties, there is no room for initiative. We're worried about, how do I get through 24? I've got to get through 24. And then, there's a week at the end of the year where I have to think about 25. There's not any time to think about 26, 28. When do I replace my equipment? When can I move systems? Like, all that takes planning. There's precious little A, time, and B, money for things like that. So that's my wish.
You're absolutely right. Looking in that rearview mirror, which has been done a lot, particularly in the last couple of years, it really doesn't allow for that forward planning, forward looking, and forecasting. Absolutely. So great answer. And I think you're fine. I think you'll still be on.
I think so.
I hope, because that was not my intention. So I want to open it up to the room if there are any questions, comments. I see a lot of smiles out there, like, I've got something I might say, but I don't think I'm going to.
You can always ask me in the hall. I'm not going anywhere. But Don's.
This question is for Brian, Don Palmer, EAC. Brian, talk to me a little bit about discussions with the legislators about appropriating money. You know, one reason I talk about a 50-50 split as a possible is because it's difficult at the federal level to convince folks to appropriate money for elections. It's just the bottom line. And then it's as equally or difficult at the state level. So it's like trying to find a solution, because I'm just not sure state legislators will come around and appropriate what's necessary to assist localities.
Great question, Commissioner Palmer, and one for which I do not have an answer. In the current political environment, I do not have an argument to convince legislators that funding elections is not strictly a county problem. Like, counties run elections, the state has no involvement, relatively speaking. They do generally will find the 5% match dollars. Most years they have done that, not every year. A couple years we've had to do it outside of the legislative process. But they recognize the value of free money when they see it. But over the years, there have been years where budgets were much tighter than they are now, and you couldn't even have the conversation because budgets across the board were tight. Now, where budgets are not as tight, you still can't have the conversation because the legislature thinks that it's not their responsibility. It's either our office for what we do or counties because that's who runs elections. I don't have a hook for them to get off of where they are currently.
One addition to that, and when you were speaking earlier as well, is that I think the profession, election officials at all levels, for a period of time, there was a conversation around, I'm not going to go testify. I'm not going to go to the board to do anything, ask for any policy change, any funding, or any of these additional things, because I don't want it to be seen that I have my finger on the scale. I'm going to take whatever comes down from on high, and that's the election I'm going to conduct. I'm not going to weigh in. And I think what we've seen is that into that void, there will be all sorts of experts that believe because they've read something, seen something, talked to someone who has voted once maybe, or has some self-proclaimed expertise, that those individuals are not restraining themselves. I think is a good way of putting it in a number of ways. They are going to those meetings, they are being vocal, and they are being numerous. And so I think into that, we need to lean into making sure that we are in fact staking that expertise as well as what the need is. And I talk to legislators quite frequently at the National Conference of State Legislators at NCSL, and I plead with them to come to your offices, talk to election officials at all levels, find out really what needs to be done to either tweak that statute so that it's not as onerous, or that it's more modern, or that it's more efficient or more effective, as well as to see. And I recall when I was in Arizona, we would have school bond elections, and they hated it that people were voting by mail because they wanted them in the schools, because schools were polling places, and they're like, we want people to come in, we want them to see the paint peeling, literally. But voters like to vote by mail. And so we need to be telling those stories, and sometimes it's an emotional thing, sometimes it's visceral. We know that others will be chiming in, not always with facts. So I think it's a real tension there to both tell the story, speak the truth, lay things out practically and transparently, and not come across as though you're trying to advocate for anything that's going to change the composition of the electorate, change the composition of turnout, or any of those things.
Right. Or change the process, because I was elected under that process, so you
There
gotta
you go.
change it. I think our local election officials do a great job of that when it comes to policy. But when it comes to budget, there really isn't an avenue. We have, the Secretary of State's office has our budget hearings, and it goes over all of our budget. And so there may be like 3 questions about elections out of 15. And so even in our own budget hearing with the legislators, we don't spend a lot of time on elections. And I don't think that there's any voice for the local election officials within our budget, because the legislature isn't telling us how to spend our HAVA money. And so I just think it's difficult to have budget discussions with the legislature from their perspective, other than a continual education effort on elections aren't free. Like, I know that your association talks to legislators, and I would keep having those discussions. I know that funding's lower on the list than half a dozen things that are floating through the legislature, and it's not the highest priority. But if it ever dies down enough, maybe those are discussions that all of us can have. Some of that's a theoretical argument, not maybe a practical one, but you're the experts. Like, they'll listen to you far more than they'll listen to me or our office, and so that's the only. I think that's kind of looking forward, but right now there's really not a way to have that discussion because to them it's settled and they're worried about everything else.
Everything else. Any closing remarks?
Well, I just want to say thank you, first of all, and thank you for the commissioners for being here. I'm very proud of the election system that we have in Kansas. I am very proud of the work that we've done. We're not perfect. There's always ways to improve, but I'm proud of the system that we have. I think it's one of the best in the country, and I will say, regardless of who's coming up next, that we do have the best local election officials anywhere in the country.
Thank you,
Thank you very
Brian.
much.
Thank you, Brian.